You're not really family, Emma. I think it's best if you and your kids skip Christmas this year. My sister Madison's words came through the phone with such casual cruelty that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her, thought perhaps the connection had garbled something, turned some innocent statement into this knife that was now lodging itself directly in my chest. But the silence that followed, that deliberate pause where she waited for my response, told me I'd heard exactly what she meant to say. I was 38 years old, a cardiovascular surgeon at Boston Medical Center, someone who held human hearts in my hands and made life or death decisions with steady precision. And yet, in that moment, I was 3 years old again, the adopted daughter who would never quite measure up, never quite belong, no matter how many years passed or how many achievements I accumulated. Madison, I don't understand, I managed, my voice sounding distant to my own ears, clinical almost, the same tone I used when delivering difficult news to patients' families. Sophie and Marcus have been looking forward to Christmas at Mom and Dad's for months. We've already bought gifts for everyone. I heard her sigh, that particular exhalation of impatience she'd perfected over our 35 years as sisters, the one that said I was being deliberately difficult, that I was making something simple into an unnecessary complication. It's just that we have limited space this year, she said, and I could picture her examining her manicured nails as she spoke, probably sitting in the sunroom of the Connecticut estate our parents had bought for her and Tyler last year, the one with 6 bedrooms and a formal dining room that could seat 20. I'm hosting Christmas for the first time, and I want it to be intimate, you know? Just the real family. Just the real family. The words hung there between us, and I wondered if she knew what she'd said, if the cruelty was intentional, or if it had simply slipped out, a truth she usually kept wrapped in prettier packaging. 35 years I'd been part of this family, adopted at age 3 after my biological parents died in a car accident. 35 years of trying to earn my place at a table where Madison had been born with a permanent reservation. The real family, I repeated slowly, and now my surgeon's hands were trembling slightly. Something that never happened in the operating room, never happened when it actually mattered. Madison, I am real family. I've been your sister for 35 years. Another sigh, heavier this time, laden with the burden of having to explain obvious things to someone too dense to grasp them naturally. You know what I mean, Emma. Don't make this into something it's not. It's just one Christmas. You and Daniel can do something special with your kids, make your own traditions. Isn't that what everyone says? That you should make your own traditions? I thought about Sophie, my 9-year-old daughter with her gap-toothed smile and her careful printing on the Christmas list she'd made for her grandparents, and Marcus, 7 years old and still young enough to believe that family meant forever, meant unconditional, meant showing up. I thought about how I would explain this to them, what words I could possibly use that wouldn't shatter something fundamental in their understanding of where they belonged in the world. Does Mom know about this? I asked, grasping for something, some appeal to higher authority that might reverse this decision. Does Dad? Madison's voice shifted slightly, taking on a defensive edge. Mom and Dad support my decision. It's my house, Emma. I get to decide who comes to Christmas. And there it was, the truth distilled to its essence. She got to decide. She got to choose who was family and who wasn't, who deserved a seat at the table, and who could be dismissed with a phone call 3 weeks before Christmas. I had spent 15 years in higher education, 4 years of undergraduate at Harvard on a full scholarship, 4 years of medical school, 5 years of residency, 2 years of fellowship, had published research in cardiac surgery journals, and saved more lives than I could count. And none of it mattered, because Madison, who had graduated from a state school with a marketing degree and now worked part-time for Tyler's father's company, had decided I wasn't really family. I hung up the phone and sat in my home office staring at the framed photo on my desk, the one from Madison's wedding 2 years ago, where we stood together in matching bridesmaid dresses, her arm around my waist, both of us smiling at the camera like sisters who actually liked each other. I remembered that day with painful clarity now, how she'd positioned me at the far end of the bridesmaid lineup, how my toast at the reception had been cut short because we were running behind schedule, even though three other bridesmaids had spoken twice as long, how my parents had given a tearful speech about watching their baby girl find true love while barely acknowledging that they had another daughter in the room. But that was just the most recent example in a lifetime of moments where I'd been carefully, systematically reminded that my place in this family was conditional, earned rather than inherent, subject to revocation at any moment. I thought back to childhood Christmases in the big house in Connecticut, how Madison would tear through piles of wrapped boxes while I'd have a smaller, neater stack, how my parents explained that they didn't want to spoil me, that I needed to understand the value of things since I'd come from difficult circumstances. I was 3 years old when they adopted me after my biological parents died in a car accident on Interstate 95, too young to remember much about my life before, except fragments, feelings, a woman's perfume, and a man's laugh. And I'd spent the next 35 years trying to prove I was worthy of the second chance the Chen family had given me. I'd excelled in school because I thought that would make them proud. That achievement would earn me the unconditional love Madison seemed to receive simply for existing. When I got into Harvard on a full academic scholarship at 17, my mother's response was, "That's wonderful, honey," followed immediately by, "Madison got elected class treasurer. Isn't that exciting?" When I graduated summa cum laude and got accepted to Harvard Medical School, my father took us all to dinner and spent most of the meal discussing Madison's new boyfriend and whether he came from a good family. When I completed my residency in cardiac surgery, one of the most competitive specialties in medicine, and got accepted for a fellowship at Mass General, my mother mentioned it to her book club and then spent 20 minutes talking about how Madison had just gotten promoted to senior marketing associate. Madison, who had attended UConn on our parents' dime, who had graduated with a 3.2 GPA in marketing, who now worked part-time for her father-in-law's commercial real estate company making what I knew was roughly a quarter of my salary, was always somehow more worthy of celebration, more worthy of attention, more worthy of the family's pride. My marriage to Daniel 3 years ago had been another opportunity for Madison to make subtle digs wrapped in sisterly concern. "Are you sure you want to marry another surgeon?" she'd asked during my bridal shower. "You'll never see each other. Don't you want a husband who'll actually be home?" At my wedding, she'd given a toast that started with, "Emma has always been so focused on her career," in a tone that made ambition sound like a character flaw, and ended with, "I just hope she remembers that family is more important than work," which got approving nods from my mother. When Sophie was born 9 months after the wedding, my parents came to visit once in the hospital and twice in the first year. When Madison got pregnant a year later, my mother practically moved into her house for the first 3 months, posting daily photos on Facebook of her time with her first grandbaby, even though Marcus was only 4 months younger. Every family gathering became an exercise in swallowing hurt, in pretending not to notice that Madison's stories were listened to with rapt attention while mine were interrupted, that her children's accomplishments warranted phone calls to all the relatives while mine received polite nods, that she looked like my mother while I looked like no one, that she had the family sense of humor while I was too serious, that she belonged in a way I never quite could. I called my mother 3 days after Madison's phone call, after spending 72 hours rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain that my children were hurting, that Sophie had asked me twice why Aunt Madison didn't want her at Christmas, and I had no answer that wouldn't damage her understanding of family, of belonging, of her place in the world. My mother answered on the fourth ring with her characteristic cheerfulness, the voice she used when she was in the middle of something more important and didn't want to be interrupted. "Emma, honey, how are you?" she asked, and I could hear the sound of cabinets closing in the background, the clatter of dishes that meant she was probably organizing something for Madison's Christmas, probably planning the intimate family gathering that my children had been excluded from. "Mom, I need to talk to you about Christmas," I said, keeping my voice level, professional almost. the same tone I used when discussing surgical options with families who didn't want to hear that their loved one needed invasive intervention. Sophie asked me yesterday why Aunt Madison doesn't want her at Christmas. She's 9 years old, Mom. How am I supposed to explain this to her? There was a pause, a long exhale that I knew meant my mother was trying to find the right words, the diplomatic phrasing that would make this my problem, instead of acknowledging that it was actually a problem at all. Madison's hosting this year, Emma. It's her decision. Don't make this difficult. The words landed like a slap, casual and dismissive, as if I were being unreasonable for questioning why my children had been uninvited from a family holiday they'd attended every year of their lives. I'm not trying to make it difficult, I said, and I heard the strain in my own voice now, the hurt bleeding through despite my best efforts to contain it. I'm trying to understand. Did I do something wrong? Did the kids do something wrong? Because Madison said we have limited space, but Mom, that house has 6 bedrooms. That doesn't make sense. My mother sighed again, heavier this time, and when she spoke, her voice had taken on that particular tone of patient explanation she used when she thought I was being deliberately obtuse. You know, Madison feels like you always got special treatment being adopted. She needs this, Emma. She needs to feel like she's the center of attention for once. Can't you just let her have this? I sat down because my legs suddenly felt unreliable, because the words I'd just heard couldn't possibly have come from my mother, couldn't possibly reflect her actual understanding of the past 35 years. Special treatment? I said slowly, testing the words, trying to make them make sense. Mom, I got special treatment? Madison got a car for her 16th birthday. I got a used bicycle. Madison's college was fully paid for. I went to Harvard on scholarship because we needed to be realistic about expenses. Madison's wedding cost $70,000. Mine cost $12 because Daniel and I paid for most of it ourselves. What special treatment are you talking about? The silence stretched between us, uncomfortable and thick, and when my mother finally spoke, her voice was tight with defensiveness. That's not fair, Emma. You know we had to be careful not to show favoritism. We didn't want you to feel like you were less than Madison because you were adopted. We were trying to treat you equally. I almost laughed at the irony, at the twisted logic that had somehow convinced my parents that treating me worse was actually treating me equally, that giving me less was somehow protecting me from feeling less than. Mom, Madison posted on Instagram yesterday about planning the intimate family Christmas. Sophie saw it. She asked me if she's not invited because she's not Grandma and Grandpa's real grandchild either. I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath, the small sound of dismay that told me this consequence hadn't occurred to her, that she hadn't thought beyond Madison's feelings to consider what this exclusion might mean to 2 children who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong daughter. Oh, Emma, that's not... We would never. Sophie and Marcus are our grandchildren. Of course they are. Her voice had softened now, taken on the placating tone she used when she realized she'd gone too far but didn't want to actually apologize. But Madison is hosting, and if this is what she needs right now, then we need to support her decision. Surely you can understand that. Just this once, can't you be the bigger person? And there it was, the familiar refrain of my entire life with this family. Be the bigger person. Don't make waves. Accommodate Madison's feelings. Earn your place at the table by being easier, more understanding, less demanding than the daughter who had arrived by birth instead of circumstance. I threw myself into work the week after that phone call with my mother, picking up extra shifts in the cardiac unit and volunteering to take consults that other surgeons didn't want during the holiday season, because staying busy meant I didn't have to think about how much it hurt that my own mother had essentially told me to accept my children's exclusion from Christmas for the sake of my sister's feelings. Daniel watched me come home exhausted at 9 and 10 at night, saw me checking my phone compulsively for messages that never came from Connecticut, and finally sat me down on the couch on a Tuesday evening when I'd just gotten home from a 12-hour day and said we needed to make actual plans for Christmas, that we couldn't just pretend it wasn't happening. We decided on a ski trip to Vermont, a resort in Stowe that Daniel found online with family suites, and a kids program. And I tried to present it to Sophie and Marcus as an adventure, something special and different, just the four of us making our own traditions. Sophie looked at me with those serious brown eyes that saw far too much and asked in a small voice, "Are we not invited to Grandma and Grandpa's because we're not their real grandchildren either?" And I felt something crack open in my chest, some protective shell I'd built around the wound of my own exclusion that had kept me from seeing how deeply this was affecting my children. I pulled her into my lap even though she was almost too big for it now, wrapped my arms around her while Marcus climbed up next to us, and I told them they were absolutely real grandchildren, that Grandma and Grandpa loved them completely, that this was complicated adult stuff that had nothing to do with them or how real they were. But even as I said the words, I wondered if I believed them, if love that could exclude children from Christmas because of their mother's birth circumstances was really love at all. And later that night, after the kids were in bed, I cried in the shower, where Daniel couldn't hear me, because I realized I'd failed to protect my children from the same conditional acceptance that had marked my entire life. Daniel's parents called from San Diego and invited us to spend Christmas with them, and I could hear the concern in his mother Elena's voice when she said they'd love to have us, that the weather was beautiful, and the kids could play on the beach. But I couldn't bear the thought of explaining to Daniel's warm, inclusive, functionally healthy family why my own family had uninvited us from Christmas. Couldn't face the pity I'd see in Elena's eyes when she understood that even after 35 years, I still wasn't quite family enough. At the hospital 2 days later, Dr. Patricia Chen found me in the surgeon's lounge staring at a cup of coffee I'd forgotten to drink, and she sat down across from me with her own cup and asked what was wrong with her characteristic directness that cut through social niceties to get to the truth. Patricia had been my mentor since my fellowship, the first person at Boston Medical who'd seen me as more than just a promising young surgeon, who'd pushed me and challenged me and believed in me, and sitting there in the quiet lounge with her steady, compassionate gaze on my face, I broke down and told her everything. I told her about Madison's phone call, about my mother's dismissal, about Sophie's question that had shattered my heart, about the lifetime of being almost but not quite enough for the family that had chosen me, but somehow never fully accepted me. And when I finally finished, Patricia was quiet for a long moment before she said, "Emma, you've spent 35 years trying to earn something you already deserved. When will you let yourself off that hook?" Her words hit me like a diagnosis I'd been avoiding. The clear statement of a condition I'd been living with so long, I'd stopped recognizing it as abnormal. And I realized sitting there that I'd been waiting my entire life for my family to give me permission to belong. Acceptance that might never come no matter what I achieved or how perfect I tried to be. We left for Vermont on December 23rd with the car packed full of ski equipment and wrapped presents and a carefully constructed atmosphere of forced cheerfulness that felt like a fragile bubble I was terrified would pop at any moment. The kids were excited, chattering in the back seat about skiing and hot chocolate and building snowmen, but I could see the way Sophie's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The way Marcus kept asking questions about whether we'd see Grandma and Grandpa soon, not understanding, or maybe understanding too well, that this Christmas was different, that we'd been set aside. My phone stayed mostly silent during the 3-hour drive north. Just one text from my father that came through around noon saying, "Have a good holiday," with no mention of the celebration happening at their house that we weren't invited to. No acknowledgement of the grandchildren he apparently had no problem excluding. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand at one point during the drive. Didn't say anything because there was nothing to say, and I was grateful for his steady presence, for the fact that he was angry on my behalf, even when I was too tired to maintain my own anger. The resort in Stowe was beautiful, exactly the kind of picture-perfect New England Christmas scene that should have been magical, with snow covering everything in pristine white and decorations everywhere, and families walking around in matching ski jackets looking happy and whole. We checked into our suite, and the kids immediately wanted to explore. So we walked around the resort property while I tried not to notice all the extended families gathered in the common areas: grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins, the kind of big family Christmas gathering that my children had been deliberately excluded from. That night on Christmas Eve, we decorated the small tree that came with the suite, hanging the ornaments we'd brought from home, and Daniel made hot chocolate while I put on Christmas music and tried to create magic out of heartbreak. Sophie looked at me at one point while we were stringing lights and said, "This is nice, Mom. Different, but nice." And I heard everything she wasn't saying in those words. Heard the sadness and confusion she was trying to be brave about. And I had to excuse myself to the bathroom, where I stood with my hands braced on the sink and reminded myself to breathe. Around 9 o'clock, after we'd put the kids to bed, I stepped out onto the small balcony attached to our suite. Needed air and space, and a moment to myself, and I called the hospital to check on my patients, even though I knew the covering physician had everything under control. Dr. Morrison answered and assured me everyone was stable, told me to stop worrying and enjoy my family, and after I hung up, I made the mistake of opening Instagram, of looking at social media even though I knew it would hurt. Madison had posted a photo 2 hours earlier, a picture of her and Tyler and my parents in front of the massive Christmas tree in my parents' Connecticut living room, everyone dressed beautifully and smiling at the camera, and the caption read, "Nothing like Christmas with the people who matter most," followed by a red heart emoji and hashtags that said family first and blessed. I stared at that caption for a long time. At those specific words, "the people who matter most." At the deliberate cruelty of that phrasing, whether Madison had intended it or not, and something in me finally broke, or maybe finally hardened. Some last hope that this had all been a misunderstanding dying in the cold Vermont air. I deleted the Instagram app right there on the balcony, just pressed and held until the icon wiggled, and then tapped the X, because I was done torturing myself with evidence of my own exclusion. And then I went back inside where Daniel was waiting, and I smiled and said everything was fine at the hospital, and we should get some sleep, because tomorrow was Christmas, and we were going to make it special for the kids, no matter what it cost me. Christmas morning came with the kind of bright winter sunlight that hurt to look at, reflecting off snow and making everything seem almost aggressively cheerful. And Daniel and I woke early to set up the last few presents under our little tree before Sophie and Marcus got up, both of us moving quietly through the suite and trying to create magic out of what felt like wreckage. The kids came running out of their room around 7:30 with exactly the kind of excitement that Christmas morning should have, and I pushed down everything I was feeling to focus on their joy, on making this morning special, despite everything it wasn't, despite the family gathering happening 3 hours away that we'd been excluded from. We opened presents slowly, savoring each one, and the kids loved everything we'd gotten them, but I kept seeing Sophie glance at her phone. Kept noticing the way Marcus would start to say something and then stop himself, and I knew they were thinking about their grandparents, about the cousins they didn't have, about the Christmas that was happening without them. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel suggested we video call his parents in San Diego, and Elena and Roberto appeared on the screen with their warm smiles and loud enthusiasm, their house full of Daniel's siblings and their kids, everyone crowding around to wave at Sophie and Marcus, and I was grateful for their inclusion, even as it highlighted what my own family had denied my children. After the call ended, I made hot chocolate and we watched a Christmas movie, the four of us curled up on the couch in our pajamas, and I tried to be present, tried to be enough family for my kids all by myself, but I felt the absence like a physical ache in my chest. Around noon, my phone rang from where I'd left it on the bedroom dresser, and I almost didn't answer it. Almost let it go to voicemail because I couldn't handle another generic Merry Christmas text, or worse, silence. But something made me get up and check. And when I saw Madison's name on the screen, my first thought was that maybe she was calling to apologize, that maybe she'd realized how cruel she'd been and wanted to make it right. I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door, answered with a cautious, "Hello," And Madison's voice came through frantic and crying in a way I'd never heard her sound before, words tumbling over each other as she said, "Emma, something's wrong with Dad. He collapsed. We're at Greenwich Hospital." And my entire body shifted into a different mode, my training taking over even as my heart started pounding. "What are his symptoms?" I asked, my voice steady and clinical even though my hands had started shaking. "Is he conscious? What did the doctors say?" Madison was barely coherent, her words breaking up with sobs as she tried to explain that he'd complained of chest pain during Christmas breakfast, that he'd collapsed in the living room, that the ambulance had brought him here, and now doctors were talking about his heart and using words she didn't understand. "They're saying something about an infarction, Emma. I don't know what that means. They're talking about surgery. I'm scared." And I could hear the genuine terror in her voice, could picture her in some hospital waiting room completely out of her depth. And despite everything that had happened between us, despite the exclusion and the cruelty and the people who matter most caption from last night, she was still my sister and he was still my father. "Put the doctor on the phone," I said, and there was a moment of fumbling and muffled conversation before a professional male voice came on the line, introducing himself as Dr. Harrison from the Greenwich Hospital Emergency Department. He explained in careful, measured terms that my father had suffered an acute myocardial infarction, that they'd done an EKG and blood work confirming significant cardiac damage, that he needed emergency cardiac catheterization and possibly bypass surgery, that their interventional cardiologist was reviewing the case now, but the blockages appeared extensive. I started asking specific questions. Technical questions about enzyme levels and ST elevation and the location of the infarction, about what imaging they'd done and what the catheterization had shown, and I heard Dr. Harrison's tone change, heard him recognize that he was talking to someone with medical knowledge. "Are you in medicine?" he asked, and I said, "I'm a cardiovascular surgeon at Boston Medical Center. He's my father. What's his ejection fraction?" Dr. Harrison's voice became more clinical, more precise, as he answered my question, and the number he gave me made my stomach drop, because 30% ejection fraction meant my father's heart was barely pumping enough blood to keep him alive, meant the damage was extensive, and the surgery would be complex and dangerous. "We've identified multivessel disease," Dr. Harrison continued, his tone respectful now that he understood who he was talking to. "3 significant blockages, 2 in the LAD and 1 in the right coronary artery. Dr. Patel performed the catheterization about 40 minutes ago, and he's recommending immediate bypass surgery, but I have to be honest with you, Dr. Ross, this is a complex case, and while we have excellent surgeons here, if this were my father, I'd want him at a specialized cardiac center with the absolute best team available." I appreciated his honesty, even as my mind was already racing through logistics, through what needed to happen in the next few hours to give my father the best possible chance, and I heard myself say, "I want him transferred to Boston Medical Center. I'm on staff there and I can have a team ready within 3 hours." But even as I said it, I was aware of the irony burning in my chest like acid. The fact that 24 hours ago I wasn't family enough to attend Christmas dinner, but now suddenly I was family enough to save his life. "Can you put my sister back on?" I asked Dr. Harrison. And there was another moment of fumbling before Madison's tearful voice came back on the line saying, "Emma, what did he say? Is Dad going to be okay?" And I could hear the genuine terror underneath her words, could hear that whatever had happened between us, she did love our father, did need him to survive this. "Madison, listen to me," I said, forcing my voice to stay calm and authoritative because one of us needed to be functional right now. "Dad needs bypass surgery, 3 bypasses actually. It's serious, but it's survivable if he gets the right care. I'm arranging to have him transferred to Boston Medical Center where I work, where I can make sure he has the best cardiac team in New England." There was a long pause, and then Madison said, "Emma, please can you come? I don't know what to do. I don't understand what any of these doctors are saying. I need you here." And those words, "I need you," Coming from the sister who had told me 3 weeks ago that I wasn't really family, who had excluded my children from Christmas, who had posted about the people who matter most just last night, those words should have filled me with rage or at least bitter satisfaction. But instead, I just felt tired and sad and aware that life didn't care about our petty family dynamics when someone's heart was failing. Daniel must have seen something change in my face because he appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, his expression questioning and concerned, and I said to Madison, "I'll be there as soon as I can, probably 3 hours. Don't let them do anything until I get there and review everything myself." And then I hung up and looked at my husband and said, "My father had a heart attack. He needs emergency bypass surgery. They want me to come." Daniel crossed the room immediately and took my hands in his touch grounding me when everything felt like it was spinning, and he asked, "What do you want to do?" Not telling me what I should do, not pushing me in either direction, just offering me the space to make my own decision about whether I was going to drop everything and rush to the bedside of the family that had excluded me from their celebration just yesterday. I thought about my father, about the man who had adopted me at age 3, who had mostly been kind even if he'd never quite stood up to Madison's jealousy, who had sent me that generic "have a good holiday" text this morning without any real warmth but also without actual cruelty. And I thought about the Hippocratic oath I'd taken 12 years ago, about the promise to use my skills to save lives regardless of personal feelings. And I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be, what kind of example I wanted to set for Sophie and Marcus, who were probably listening from the other room. "I need to go," I finally said, hearing my own voice sound distant and professional. "He needs surgery, and I don't trust it to someone who doesn't know his full medical history, who doesn't know about the medication allergy he has, or the complications he had with anesthesia during his appendectomy 15 years ago." Daniel nodded like he'd expected this answer, like he'd already known I wouldn't be able to stay away even after everything that had happened. And he said, "Then we're all going. I'm not letting you drive 3 hours alone while you're upset, and the kids will want to see their grandfather." The next 20 minutes were a blur of rapid packing, of me explaining to Sophie and Marcus in careful, age-appropriate terms that Grandpa was sick and needed special heart surgery that Mommy could help with, of watching their faces transform from Christmas morning joy to worry and confusion, of Daniel efficiently gathering our belongings while I stood in the bedroom making phone calls with shaking hands. I called Boston Medical Center first, got patched through to Dr. Raymond, who was the chief of cardiovascular surgery, and I explained the situation as clinically as I could manage, asked him to arrange for an immediate transfer and to have the interventional cardiology team ready to review imaging as soon as we arrived. "Emma," Dr. Raymond said, his voice gentle because he'd known me for 8 years and could probably hear the strain underneath my professional tone. "We'll have everything ready, but are you sure you want to be involved in this? It's your father. That's a conflict of interest. You know you can't be the primary surgeon." I knew that, had already thought through the ethics and the hospital policies, but I said, "I need to be there, Raymond. I need to at least consult. And if you're willing, I'd like to scrub in and assist because no one knows his history like I do." And after a moment he agreed and said he'd have Dr. Torres lead the surgery since Torres was the best cardiovascular surgeon on staff, besides myself. Then I called ahead to the interventional cardiology team, briefed the on-call physician about what to expect, gave them my father's full medical history from memory, including medication allergies and previous procedures and family cardiac history. Felt myself slipping into doctor mode because that was easier than sitting with the emotional reality of what was happening. By the time I'd finished the calls, we were in the car heading south, retracing the route we'd taken just yesterday when we'd been driving away from my family. And the irony wasn't lost on me that we were spending Christmas Day rushing back to the people who hadn't wanted us there in the first place. We pulled into the Greenwich Hospital parking lot around 4 o'clock on Christmas afternoon, the sky already starting to darken with that early winter sunset, and I felt my body shift into a different mode the moment I stepped out of the car, felt myself becoming Dr. Ross instead of Emma, the excluded daughter, because that was the only way I was going to get through whatever came next. Daniel took Sophie and Marcus's hands and followed me through the automatic doors into the emergency department, and I saw my family immediately in the waiting area off to the left, Madison and Tyler sitting close together with her head on his shoulder, my mother Linda pacing near the windows with her arms wrapped around herself, all three of them looking devastated and exhausted in a way that made them seem smaller somehow, less powerful than they'd always appeared in my mind. Linda saw me first, and her face crumpled completely, and she rushed toward me saying, "Oh, thank God you're here, Emma. Thank God." And I felt her arms go around me in a hug that should have felt comforting, but instead felt complicated and wrong, because 3 weeks ago, she'd told me not to make things difficult when I asked why my children were excluded from Christmas. But now suddenly my presence was a relief. Suddenly I was needed and wanted because I had skills they required. I gently extracted myself from her embrace and said, "Where is he? I need to see his charts." My voice professional and calm even though my heart was racing, and Madison stood up from her chair, looking pale and red-eyed, and said, "Emma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know who else to call." And I noticed she didn't say she was sorry for excluding us from Christmas or for the people who matter most Instagram post, just sorry that she'd had to call me. Sorry that she'd needed something from the sister she'd deemed not really family. "Where is he?" I repeated, and Tyler pointed toward the emergency department doors and said, "They have him in one of the cardiac bays. The doctor said we had to wait out here." And I nodded and told Daniel to stay with the kids and my mother. Told him I'd come back out as soon as I'd assessed the situation. I walked through those doors with my hospital ID from Boston Medical Center held up even though I had no privileges here. And a nurse started to stop me, but I said, "I'm Dr. Emma Ross, cardiovascular surgery. I'm here about my father Richard Chen, who was brought in with an MI." And something about my tone or my credentials, or maybe just my obvious determination, made her step aside and direct me to Bay 7. Dr. Harrison was there reviewing monitors, and he looked up when I entered, and recognition crossed his face as he said, "Dr. Ross, I'm glad you made it." And I shook his hand briefly before turning my attention to the man in the bed. My father looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, his skin gray, and his face drawn with pain despite whatever medication they'd given him. Monitors beeping steadily, and an IV line running into his left arm, and for a moment I couldn't be Dr. Ross, could only be Emma seeing her father dying and feeling the terror of that reality crash over me. Then Dr. Harrison started talking, and I forced myself back into professional mode, reviewing the charts he handed me, examining the catheterization images on the computer screen, seeing the blockages exactly where he'd described them, 3 significant occlusions that needed immediate surgical intervention. "Dr. Patel did the cath?" I asked, and Harrison nodded and said, "He's one of the best interventional cardiologists in Connecticut. He should be back up here in a few minutes. He wanted to consult with our cardiac surgery team about the approach," and I said, "I'm transferring him to Boston Medical Center. I've already arranged for a team there." Dr. Patel arrived about 5 minutes later, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, who extended his hand and said, "You're Dr. Emma Chen Ross? I've read your work on minimally invasive revascularization techniques. Didn't realize you were Richard's daughter." And under different circumstances, I might have felt proud that my research was known beyond Boston. But right then, I just wanted to see my father, to tell him I was here. They let me into his bay, and I approached the bed carefully, and my father's eyes opened when I touched his hand, and when he saw me, his whole face transformed with relief, and something that looked like shame as he whispered, "Baby girl, you came." And I felt something crack in my chest, because he hadn't called me that since I was maybe 10 years old. Hadn't used any term of endearment in years, and now here it was when he thought he might be dying. I held my father's hand and felt how cold his skin was despite the heated blankets they'd layered over him, and I said, "I'm here, Dad. I'm going to take care of you." My voice steady, even though everything inside me was shaking, and he squeezed my fingers weakly and whispered, I don't deserve you here. Not after. But I cut him off, saying, We'll talk later. Right now, we save your life. That's all that matters. Because I couldn't let him start apologizing when he needed every bit of strength for what was coming next. I spent 20 minutes reviewing every detail with Dr. Patel and Dr. Harrison, checking the catheterization images again, confirming the transfer arrangements to Boston Medical Center. And then I went back out to the waiting room where my family was sitting in that terrible suspended animation that happens when someone you love is dying, and there's nothing you can do but wait. Daniel stood up immediately when he saw me, and I could see the question in his eyes, and I said, He's stable for now, but he needs surgery tonight. I'm having him transferred to Boston within the hour. And my mother said, Boston? Why can't they do it here? And I explained as patiently as I could that this was a complex case requiring a specialized team, that I wanted him where I could ensure he got the absolute best care, and Madison said, You're going to do the surgery? And I shook my head, saying, I can't be the primary surgeon, conflict of interest, but I'll assist, and I'll make sure the best cardiac surgeon in New England is leading the team. The ambulance arrived about 40 minutes later, and I told Daniel to take Sophie and Marcus with my mother in her car, that I needed to ride with my father to monitor him during transport, and Daniel understood, without me having to explain further, just kissed my forehead and said, I'll be right behind you. And I saw my mother looking at him with something like surprise, maybe realizing for the first time what a true partner looked like. I climbed into the ambulance with my father and the transport team, and as we pulled away from Greenwich Hospital with the lights flashing, but no siren, because we didn't want to stress his heart further, I watched through the rear windows as Madison and Tyler got into their Mercedes to follow us, and the whole situation felt surreal. Felt like I was living in some alternate reality where the family that had excluded me from Christmas was now following me desperately through the night because I was the only one who could save them. During the hour-long transport to Boston, my father drifted in and out of consciousness, the pain medication and the stress of the day making him confused and uninhibited, and about 20 minutes into the drive, he opened his eyes and looked at me and said, I failed you, Emma. I let Madison's jealousy make me weak. And I felt my professional mask crack slightly as I said, Dad, don't. Save your strength. But he kept talking like he'd been holding these words in for years and couldn't contain them anymore. Need to say it, he whispered, his voice rough and strained. You were always enough. Always our daughter. I was just afraid of Madison's anger. Afraid of her feeling less than, so I let you be less than instead. And I felt tears burning in my eyes, but I blinked them back because I needed to stay focused, needed to keep monitoring his vital signs on the portable equipment, needed to be Dr. Ross right now, instead of the daughter who had spent 35 years wondering why she wasn't quite good enough. I held his hand and watched the monitors and processed his confession while the ambulance moved through the darkening evening, and I thought about all the times he could have said these things, all the moments when he could have stood up for me against Madison's subtle cruelty or my mother's passive enabling, and I felt anger mixing with my fear for his life, felt the complexity of loving someone who had hurt you, not through active cruelty, but through passive failure to protect. We arrived at Boston Medical Center around 7 in the evening, and my team was waiting exactly as I'd requested. And I saw Dr. Patricia Chen standing near the emergency entrance, and felt a rush of gratitude that she'd come in on Christmas night to support me through this, because Patricia understood what this family situation had cost me over the years, had listened to me process the hurt during countless coffee breaks and late-night conversations in the hospital cafeteria. Patricia took over my father's care as the attending physician while I went to the surgical prep area, and I was grateful for her presence because it meant someone I trusted completely was making the decisions while I couldn't be objective. And Dr. Michael Torres met me outside the scrub room with his characteristic calm intensity and said, Emma, I've reviewed everything you sent over. This is going to be challenging but manageable. Are you sure you want to scrub in? And I looked at him and said, I need to be in there, Michael. I need to know I did everything I could. and he nodded understanding because he had 3 daughters of his own, and I knew he would feel exactly the same way. I scrubbed in with the methodical precision I'd learned over 15 years of surgical training and practice, the warm water and antiseptic soap running over my hands and forearms while I counted the required time in my head, and I forced myself into that mental space where emotion couldn't exist, where there was only anatomy and technique and the absolute focus required to repair a human heart. Except this time, the heart belonged to the man who had raised me and failed me and loved me imperfectly for 35 years. When I entered the operating room, my father was already under anesthesia, his chest prepped and draped so that he became not Richard Chen, but a surgical field, a problem to be solved, and I positioned myself across from Torres while the surgical nurses and anesthesiologist took their places, and the perfusionist prepared the heart-lung bypass machine that would keep my father alive while we stopped his heart to repair it. Torres caught my eye over our masks and said, "Ready?" And I nodded once, and he made the first incision down the center of my father's chest with steady confidence. And I watched his hands move through the familiar steps of opening the sternum, spreading the retractors, exposing the pericardium, and I assisted exactly as I would with any other patient, anticipating what Torres needed before he asked, maintaining the precise level of professional coordination that made complex surgery possible. The bypass was established successfully, and my father's heart slowed and stopped as the machine took over, and Torres began the painstaking work of harvesting the saphenous vein from the leg for the grafts, while I prepared the coronary arteries, identifying the exact locations where we would attach the bypasses to root blood around the dangerous blockages that had nearly killed him. The first anastomosis went smoothly, Torres's hands absolutely steady as he sewed the delicate connection between the graft and the coronary artery with sutures finer than human hair, and I assisted with the exposure and kept the field clear, and everything was progressing exactly as it should until about 3 hours into the surgery when the anesthesiologist said, "Pressure's dropping." And I looked up at the monitors and saw my father's blood pressure falling despite the bypass support. Torres said calmly, "Let's have some Neo, point 0.5 mics per kilo." And I called out the order, even as the anesthesiologist was already drawing it up, and we watched the numbers stabilize, but my heart was racing even though my hands remained perfectly still, and I realized that some part of me had believed that my presence in the operating room would protect him, that my skill and will could prevent anything from going wrong, which was irrational but deeply felt. We continued with the second bypass graft, and Torres was halfway through the anastomosis when my father's heart rhythm became irregular on the monitor, and the anesthesiologist said, "VTAC," and Torres made an instant decision saying, "Emma, I need you to take over here. Your hands are steadier right now, and this connection has to be perfect." And without hesitation, I moved into the primary position and took the needle holder from his hands and completed the delicate suture line, while he managed the arrhythmia with careful medication adjustments. And I was aware of the entire OR team watching this moment, aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a daughter literally saving her father's life with her own hands. But I couldn't think about that symbolism or that weight, could only focus on each individual stitch, each perfect placement of the suture through vessel wall that was barely thicker than tissue paper. The third bypass took another 90 minutes, and by the time we were weaning my father off the heart-lung machine, it was nearly 2 in the morning, and I had been standing at that operating table for over 6 hours. But when his heart started beating on its own again, with a strong, steady rhythm, when the monitors showed good pressures and stable vitals, I felt something break open inside my chest that I'd been holding rigid and contained since Madison's phone call that afternoon. Torres stepped back from the table and said, "Let's close him up." And the team moved through the final stages of the surgery with efficient precision. And by the time we were finishing the sternal closure, it was nearly 2:30 in the morning, and every muscle in my body ached, but my mind was sharp and clear, with the crystalline focus that comes after you've walked through fire and survived. My father was transferred to the cardiac ICU with careful attention to every line and monitor, and I walked beside the gurney even though I wasn't needed because I couldn't quite let go yet. Couldn't quite trust that we'd actually made it through, and the ICU team received him with the competent calm of professionals who did this every night. But I saw them glance at me with something like respect mixed with sympathy, because everyone in the hospital knew by now that Dr. Ross had just spent 6 hours saving her own father's life. I stripped off my surgical gown and gloves in the scrub room and stood at the sink washing my hands again, even though they were already clean, just needing the ritual of it. And I caught sight of myself in the mirror and barely recognized the exhausted woman looking back at me with red-rimmed eyes and hair plastered to her forehead with sweat. Patricia found me there and put her hand on my shoulder and said, "He's stable, Emma. You did it. Now come talk to your family." And I nodded and followed her out toward the surgical waiting room. And I realized I had no idea what I was going to say to these people who had excluded me from Christmas 3 weeks ago and were now waiting desperately for me to tell them I'd saved the patriarch they all revolved around. The waiting room was that special kind of liminal space that exists in hospitals late at night. Fluorescent lights too bright against the darkness outside the windows, and I saw my family scattered around the room in various states of exhausted anxiety before they saw me, and I had one moment to observe them as the surgeon rather than the daughter and sister. One moment to see Madison's face blotchy from crying, and my mother's hands twisted together in her lap, and Daniel holding Marcus against his chest, while Sophie leaned against his shoulder, both kids finally asleep after hours of worried waiting. Then my mother looked up and saw me standing there in my scrubs, and she made a sound that was half gasp and half sob, and everyone came alert at once. Madison jumping to her feet and Tyler right behind her, and Daniel carefully shifting so he wouldn't wake the kids. And I stepped fully into the room and said in my doctor voice, calm and professional, "He made it through surgery. The next 48 hours are critical, but he's stable." And my mother collapsed back into her chair with her hands over her face, and Madison started crying harder, and I continued with the medical details because that's what they needed to hear, explaining that we'd done 3 bypass grafts, that his EKG looked good, that we'd keep him in an induced coma for the next 24 hours to let his body begin the healing process. Daniel stood up carefully and brought Sophie and Marcus to me, both of them stirring awake, and I knelt down despite my exhausted legs and pulled my children against me and finally let my professional mask slip just slightly, let myself be their mother instead of the surgeon. And Sophie whispered, "Is Grandpa going to be okay?" And I said, "Yes, baby. Grandpa's going to be okay." And I felt something release in my chest that I'd been holding tight since Madison's phone call that afternoon. Madison approached slowly, hesitantly, and said, "Emma, thank you doesn't even begin." And I looked up at her from where I was kneeling with my children and said flatly, exhaustion making me blunt, "He's my father. Of course I came." And Madison flinched and said, "After what I said, after Christmas, I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't." And I stood up and looked at my sister directly and said, "That's the difference between us, Madison. You exclude people when it's convenient. I show up when I'm needed. Family doesn't have conditions." My mother made a small sound and said, "Emma, sweetie." But I held up my hand and said, "Mom, not now. I've been awake for 24 hours and just performed surgery on my father. We'll talk, but not now." And I saw her face crumple, but I didn't have anything left to give her in that moment. Patricia materialized at my elbow and said, "I live 10 minutes from here. There's plenty of room for all of you to get some sleep." But I shook my head and said, "I'm staying here tonight. I need to monitor him." And Daniel said quietly, "Emma, there's an entire ICU staff monitoring him." But I just looked at him, and he understood and nodded and said, "Okay, then I'll take the kids to Patricia's and come back in the morning." Daniel left with the kids around 3 in the morning, and the hospital settled into that particular quiet that comes in the deepest part of night when even the emergency department slows down and the hallways echo with footsteps instead of voices. And I positioned myself in the ICU family area with a direct view through the window to where my father lay connected to a ventilator and half a dozen monitors, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. I checked on him every hour, even though the nursing staff was excellent, and I trusted them completely. But I needed to see with my own eyes that his vitals remained stable, that his heart rhythm stayed strong and regular, that the Swan-Ganz catheter showed good cardiac output. And each time I reviewed his numbers, I felt myself breathe a little easier, even though I knew we weren't out of danger yet, and wouldn't be for at least 48 hours. Around 4 in the morning, I was reviewing his latest labs on the computer in the family area when I heard footsteps and looked up to see Madison standing in the doorway, still wearing the same clothes from yesterday, her face exhausted and stripped of makeup and somehow younger looking because of it. She said quietly, "Couldn't sleep. Figured you'd be here." And I nodded and turned back to the computer screen, and she came in and sat down 3 chairs away from me, both of us watching our father through the glass in silence for what felt like a long time. The ICU was dimly lit for the night shift, and the monitors cast greenish glows on my father's face, and I could see the rise and fall of his chest and hear the soft beeping of the machines even through the window. And finally, Madison said, "I've been jealous of you our entire lives." And her voice was so raw and honest that I looked at her in surprise. I said, "Of me? You were always the favorite." And Madison actually laughed, a bitter sound without humor, and said, "Are you kidding? You were special, the chosen one. Mom and Dad chose you. They were stuck with me." I stared at my sister trying to process this completely inverted version of our shared history and said, "So you spent 35 years punishing me for being adopted?" And Madison flinched and said, "I spent 35 years terrified they loved you more because they picked you. I was just the accident that came first." The twisted logic of it was almost incomprehensible to me, and I said, "Madison, I was the outsider, always. You looked like them, acted like them. I was the one who didn't fit." But Madison shook her head and said, "You were extraordinary. Harvard and medical school and saving lives. How do I compete with that?" I felt something crack open in my chest, some understanding I'd never accessed before, and I said, "It was never a competition. I just wanted a sister. I just wanted to belong." And my voice broke on the last word, and suddenly we were both crying. Not the polite tears you cry in public, but the raw, ugly crying that comes from years of accumulated pain and misunderstanding. Madison said through her tears, "I know that now, sitting here watching you save his life, watching you show up after everything I said. I know that now." And I said, "You hurt my kids, Madison." Sophie asked if she wasn't a real grandchild either. And Madison made a sound like I'd struck her and said, "Oh God, Emma, what have I done?" We sat there in the dim ICU family area at 4 in the morning, with our father fighting for his life 20 feet away, and for the first time in 35 years, we were actually honest with each other, actually seeing each other instead of the distorted versions we'd created in our minds. And I realized that we'd both been wrong, both been hurt, both been fighting for scraps of validation that should have been freely given. Madison pulled her knees up to her chest in the uncomfortable ICU waiting room chair and said, "It was Tyler's promotion party. Do you remember? Back in October?" And I nodded because I remembered it clearly, remembered my parents hosting a dinner at their country club to celebrate Tyler making partner at his firm, remembered sitting at that table feeling invisible while everyone toasted his success. Madison continued, "Tyler said something, just a casual comment. He said, 'Emma's really the superstar of the family, huh?' And he was smiling when he said it. He meant it as a compliment. But Mom got this look on her face and said, 'Well, Madison has accomplished so much too,' in this defensive voice, and I spiraled." And her voice cracked on the last word, and I sat there trying to reconcile this mundane moment with the devastation it had caused. I said slowly, "So you banned my children from Christmas because you felt insecure?" And even as I said it, I could hear how it sounded, how the punishment in no way fit the crime, And Madison covered her face with her hands and said, "When you say it like that, it sounds insane. It felt like I was finally in control of something, like I could create one space where I was the center, and you were just not there." The honesty of it was brutal, and I felt anger rising in my chest again, and I said, "You hurt my kids, Madison." Sophie asked if she wasn't a real grandchild either. And Madison made a sound like something breaking, and dropped her hands and looked at me with devastated eyes and said, "Oh God, Emma, what have I done?" I saw that she genuinely hadn't thought through the implications, hadn't considered how her jealousy of me would translate to my innocent children. And part of me wanted to rage at her for that thoughtlessness, but another part of me recognized the real remorse in her face. I said quietly, "I don't know if I can forgive this quickly. My children cried on Christmas Eve. They asked me what they did wrong, and I had to pretend everything was fine while my heart was breaking for them." And Madison was crying again and said, "I understand. I need you to know it was never about you not being family. You were always more family than me. That was the whole problem." I stared at her, trying to process this completely inverted reality, and said with frustration bleeding into my voice, "That's not how family works. There's not a finite amount of love. Mom and Dad could have loved us both equally if they'd just treated us equally." And suddenly we were both seeing it. The real problem crystallizing between us in that dim ICU waiting room at 4:30 in the morning. It wasn't that our parents hadn't loved us, they had loved us both, but they'd loved us differently, and in their attempt to make sure I never felt less than for being adopted, they'd somehow made Madison feel less than for being ordinary, and in their attempt to celebrate Madison's biological connection, they'd somehow made me feel less than for lacking it. And they'd created this competition neither of us had wanted, but both of us had been trapped in for 35 years. I said, "They did this to us, not on purpose, but they created this dynamic." And Madison nodded and said, "I know, but I chose how to respond to it, and I chose cruelty. And that's on me." And I was surprised by her taking responsibility. And then I heard footsteps and looked up to see our mother standing in the doorway in yesterday's clothes, looking older than I'd ever seen her look. Linda said quietly, "You're both right, and both wrong, and I owe you both an apology." And she came into the waiting area and sat down across from Madison and me, and for the first time and maybe ever, the three of us were just honest with each other without performance or pretense. Mom said, "I overcompensated with Madison because I felt guilty about Emma being adopted. I worried constantly that Emma would feel less than, but in trying to prevent that, I made Madison feel less than instead." And her voice was thick with tears, and she looked between us and said, "I failed both my daughters by treating you differently, instead of just loving you equally, by making everything a comparison, instead of celebrating you each as individuals." I felt something shift in my chest, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. And I said, "I needed to hear that. I needed to know you saw what happened." And Madison said, "I needed to hear it too, but I still made my own choices. Mom, you didn't tell me to exclude Emma from Christmas." My father woke up the day after surgery around 10 in the morning, and the first thing the ICU nurses did was page me, even though I'd only been asleep for 3 hours in the on-call room. And when I got to his bedside, they were already reducing his sedation and preparing to extubate him. And I stood there in yesterday's scrubs, watching the respiratory therapist remove the breathing tube while my father gagged and coughed and finally opened his eyes fully. The first thing he saw was me standing on his left side and Madison on his right, and our mother at the foot of his bed, all three of us there together. And his eyes filled with tears immediately, and he tried to speak, but his throat was too raw from the tube, so I squeezed his hand and said, "Don't talk yet, Dad. Your throat needs time to heal. You're doing great. The surgery was successful." But he shook his head slightly and croaked out, "My girls, all my girls." And then he was crying in earnest, and so was Mom, and even Madison had tears streaming down her face. Over the next 3 days, while my father recovered in the cardiac ICU and then transferred to the step-down unit, We had conversations that should have happened years ago. Conversations that were painful and honest and necessary. And my father told me with his voice still rough and weak that he had allowed Madison's insecurity to guide his actions for too long, that he'd thought he was keeping peace by giving Madison extra attention and validation, but he'd really just enabled a toxic dynamic that hurt both his daughters. He said, "Emma, you have always been my daughter, completely and fully my daughter. From the moment we brought you home at 3 years old, you were mine. And I'm so sorry I let you question that. I'm so sorry I didn't shut down the comparisons and the differential treatment. I thought I was being diplomatic, but I was being a coward." I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand with all its IV lines and monitoring wires, and I said, "I needed to hear that, Dad. I've needed to hear that for 35 years. And he squeezed my hand with what little strength he had and said, "You're going to hear it every day for the rest of my life, if that's what it takes." On the third day after surgery, when my father was strong enough for visitors beyond immediate family, Daniel brought Sophie and Marcus to see him, and I watched my children approach their grandfather's bedside cautiously because they'd never seen him look so vulnerable. And my father looked at my kids and said, "Sophie, Marcus, come here, please. Grandpa needs to tell you something important." Sophie and Marcus came closer, and my father said, "You are my grandchildren, real as real gets. Blood doesn't make family, and I'm sorry anyone ever let you think you were less than fully ours. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to make sure you always knew you belonged completely." Sophie started crying and climbed carefully onto the bed to hug him, and Marcus followed, and my father held my children while tears ran down his face, and I had to turn away because the sight of it was breaking my heart and healing it simultaneously. Later that same day, Madison asked if she could talk to Sophie and Marcus, and I hesitated, but Daniel nodded at me, and I said, "Okay, but I'm staying in the room." And Madison knelt down to their level in the hospital corridor and said, "I need to tell you both something. Aunt Madison made a mistake, a big one. I told your mom you couldn't come to Christmas, and that was wrong. You're my niece and nephew, and I love you, and I'm so sorry I hurt you." Marcus looked at her seriously with his 7-year-old wisdom and said, "Why did you do it?" And Madison's face crumpled, but she said honestly, "Because I was jealous of your mom and I wasn't thinking about how it would hurt you, but that's not an excuse. I was wrong and I'm sorry." Sophie said quietly, "Are we invited to Christmas next year?" And Madison said, "Yes, absolutely yes. And every year after that, I promise." We started making plans for a real Christmas celebration once my father was released from the hospital. A do-over that would include everyone equally. But I also knew that grand gestures weren't enough. And so one evening when my mother and Madison were both there, I said clearly, "Things have to change from here. Equal treatment, equal respect, equal inclusion, or I'm done. I won't keep exposing my children or myself to a dynamic that makes us feel less than." My mother said immediately, "Agreed, completely agreed, and I think we should all do family therapy. We need professional help to undo these patterns." And Madison nodded and said, "I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you again, Emma. I don't want to lose this chance to actually be sisters." My father was discharged after 1 week with an excellent prognosis for full recovery, and I took a month of medical leave from the hospital to help manage his initial recovery period and cardiac rehabilitation. And during that month, I stayed at my parents' house in Connecticut, and Daniel brought the kids on weekends, and slowly, carefully, we began to build something different from what we'd had before. 3 months after my father's surgery, I stood in my parents' living room in Connecticut, watching Sophie and Marcus play a board game with their grandfather on the floor, and marveled at how much had changed and how much work it had taken to get here. My father's recovery had been textbook perfect, his cardiac rehabilitation progressing so well that his cardiologist said he had the heart function of a man 10 years younger, and he'd thrown himself into physical therapy and lifestyle changes with the zeal of someone who'd been given a second chance and knew it. The family therapy sessions happened every other week, all of us sitting in Dr. Morrison's office in Stamford, working through decades of dysfunction, and it was hard and uncomfortable and necessary, the kind of work that left me emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter. Madison and I were building something that resembled an actual sisterhood, carefully and honestly, starting from scratch instead of pretending the past hadn't happened. And some days it felt fragile, like it might break if we pushed too hard, but other days it felt surprisingly solid. Today was the make-up Christmas we'd planned, scheduled for mid-March when my father was strong enough to enjoy it fully, and my mother had decorated the house with the same care she'd given to the December celebration I'd been excluded from. Except this time Sophie and Marcus were at the center of it all, their artwork displayed on the mantel and their favorite foods on the menu. Madison found me in the kitchen where I was refilling my coffee and said quietly, "Can we talk for a minute?" And I nodded and followed her out to the sunroom where we could see the early spring garden beginning to show green shoots. Madison turned to face me and said, "I know this doesn't fix everything. I know we have years of work ahead of us. But thank you for saving him, for giving us a chance to fix this, for not walking away when you had every right to." I looked at my sister and saw genuine remorse and genuine effort. And I said honestly, "I didn't do it for you, Madison. I did it because that's who I am. Because when someone needs help, I show up. But I'm glad we're finally being honest with each other. I'm glad we're trying." She nodded and wiped her eyes and said, "I'm trying to be better. I'm working on it in therapy. Working on understanding why I needed you to be less, so I could be more." And I said, "I know you are. I can see it." Later that afternoon, my mother insisted on taking a family photo, all of us together in front of the fireplace. And this time, when I looked at the camera, I wasn't searching for proof that I belonged. I was simply there, present and whole. That evening, I drove back to Boston with Daniel and the kids, asleep in the back seat. And I thought about how I'd spent 35 years waiting for my family to validate my place among them, and how I'd finally stopped waiting and simply claimed it. The next morning, I was back in the operating room at Boston Medical Center, performing a complex valve replacement with Patricia observing from the gallery. And afterward, in the surgeon's lounge, Patricia asked, "How's the family situation?" And I said, "Better. Not perfect, but better. Turns out I didn't need them to validate me after all." Patricia smiled and asked, "What changed?" And I thought about it and said, "I remembered that my worth isn't determined by whether they recognize it. I'm a good surgeon, a good mother, a good person, and those things are true whether my family sees them or not." I finished my post-op notes and headed home to Daniel and Sophie and Marcus, to the family I'd built that had been my foundation through everything, and I thought about Madison's words, about not being really family. And I knew now that she'd been wrong. I was always family. I just needed to believe it myself. And once I did, everything else fell into place. Not perfectly, not without pain, but authentically. And that was worth more than any Christmas invitation ever could be.